Gary, this is something probably that you could answer, just given your expertise around this, is what might we see with shopping centers in terms of storage and fulfillment for e-commerce or click and collect?
As anchors vacate, it will create this space, and it's whether or not that space can actually be used for fulfillment purposes, supporting inbound goods into the mall for all the retailers being booked in, being stored. And one of three things happening. One is to top up the shelves day to day. The other one is click and collect across multiple banners. And obviously home delivery is an extension of that. That for me is a great opportunity of malls. Mixed use, single use, it doesn't matter. But that fundamental concept of having an app people can sit on their settees and shop across brands, and to give a direction whether or not I'll come and pick that up by drive past, and you can put it in my boot, or you can bring it to my porch, or cross my threshold, or I'll come and pick it up by actually going to the store. They're the two missing pieces of a jigsaw for me. One is converting that former, say, anchor like Sears, because certainly my local mall, that Sears closed in 2017, is still empty, 2021. That must be a big cost for that mall. And the other one is finding an app which can go across all of the brands, not just the ones with existing capabilities in putting their stuff out on the web, but actually all brands. And if you come into my mall as a mall owner, I want you to sign up to this set of systems. You can interface them with your existing POS and digital applications, but you must do this so we can then present to our community, as opposed to, well, you've got a Canadian Tire app, you use that for that, and etc. You need to combine all these things into an omni-mall as opposed to individual brands.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in the make-move sale flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
This is a Retail Insider podcast.
You're listening to the interview series.
Welcome to the Retail Insider Podcast. I'm your host today, Craig Patterson, and we're joined here with two guests. We're joined with Gary Newbury. He's a senior executive on call and supply chain specialist for the last mile. We've also got Jeff Davenport. He's a real estate analytics specialist and strategist. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Craig. Good to be here.
And a quick word from our podcast episode sponsor. Swift is a rapidly growing Canadian same-day shipping company that has partnered exclusively with Retail Insider.
Today, we're going to be talking a bit about shopping centers, where they were, what's been happening, and where things are going here.
Yeah, I won't go into too much detail, but the focus, I think, of the conversation is around what do we do with these temples of consumerism? So let's start with the mass proliferation of malls out in the suburbs. Those happened, at least in the United States, as a response to what folks call white flight, which is the desegregation of schools and a rise in crime that came about in the late 60s, early 70s. It just gathered momentum and steam. More people moved out from urban cores. It didn't feel safe They wanted their own school systems. And so that's how you had a massive spread out into what then were the exurbs. When they became populated enough suburbs, mall developers saw an opportunity. It was cheap land. They could go buy a farm and build a mall. And they would bring their department store anchors with them. That was the draw for the mall. And then really they made their profit on the small shop tenants that they would fill in the in-between space with. That continued. A bunch of different folks did it, and then their properties were bought. They were compiled. REITs, really came into fat in the 80s and 90s. So they consolidated all of these large properties, continued to build as well. Suburban growth slowed, I guess, in the early 2000s. But, and this is a key point, the analysts and banks really didn't like to have mixed use ownership. They wanted pure play office, pure play retail, and really not just retail. They wanted you to be a pure play shopping center owner or a mall owner. And that's it. I worked at CBL and Associates, and we had to sell off our strip center portfolio, A, because it was profitable, but B, the analysts really wanted a pure play mall REIT. So that's what you've got here today with all of these malls under a few owners. They're not exactly alike, but they've got a lot of the same tenants. So that's really kind of the history of how we got to this point, as far as why they're there and why they have the tenant mix that they do, and why these owners don't have a mixed use property there, why it's just a shopping center.
I'm interested in the genesis between a department store and a mall. If we go right back to the start of this, were they together? Were they often the same organization that the department store developed them out to find, enough space to plant themselves on it and attracted some retailers, or were they actually on separate journeys? They just happened to form, what we see as a current state of the mall format.
The answer is yes to all of it. They initially were developing some of their own centers. Eventually, I would like to call it a partnership between mall developers rather than one being a leader and the other following. They really talked a lot to each other about where they wanted to be, where they thought they could do business. And oftentimes, even when I was working for a mall developer, we would be shown a site from a department store. They would say, look, we've looked at the demographics. We think we can do some good business here. Why don't you build a mall? We'll be your partner in that. So, a lot of the times the department stores would commit to that expenditure to build their store. The mall small shop owner would come in and develop the pad, the land, deliver the pad to the department store. The department store was responsible for their own construction, and the mall landlord did the rest. And so, when you talk about the suburban malls, you're talking about 4, maybe 5 department store anchors, or at least what used to be department store anchors in each property. So yeah, it was a partnership, and they followed each other. A lot of them were chasing the same customers, and it was a play on critical mass. If we all go together and hold hands, everyone's going to have to come to us for their shopping needs. So that's how it evolved here over time.
I think it's fascinating. You look at some places like in Texas where there was so much mall construction. I was watching it, and they really came into their own. I think they each had a Neiman Marcus store at one time, and Neiman's, since vacated, which I think is incredible. There's this turnover in terms of what's new and popular. In the case of Canada, we haven't seen quite the same dramatic number of shopping centers built, but here in Canada, we didn't really have the quote unquote white flight that the United States had, but certainly there were elements of that. I think there was a real shift to suburbanization after World War II. And with that, the shopping centers followed, and the department stores, because department stores were really the domain of the downtown core in the early 1900s, right?
Oh yeah, they were like that through most of America through the 70s. That's where the department store was, and they didn't expand out into the malls until the first mall was built in a market further out in the suburbs.
I think it's really fascinating because the suburban shopping center really did, I think, at least in part, lead to significant changes in the downtown cores in both the United States and Canada. Especially, I think, in the United States, to the point that if you look at a downtown in an American city, there are not that many left that actually have department stores in the downtown core, which I think is almost catastrophic to a degree, because those were gathering centers for communities. Here in Canada now, Winnipeg and Edmonton are 2 major cities that no longer have department stores in their downtown cores, but have thriving suburban shopping centers. It's really quite dramatic. And in my opinion, it's unfortunate, but it is the way that things have progressed.
Agreed on all counts. You hit the nail on the head there.
Goodness. Now let's talk a little bit about just before the pandemic. I can say from my observations, things were starting to struggle a little bit. We were seeing increased vacancies in shopping centers. I'd mapped out that over 1,000 store locations were set to close in Canada, which sounded pretty dramatic at the time. That would actually not be too bad considering, the pandemic situation now. Tell me a little bit about what you were seeing, Jeff and Gary, just before the pandemic here around the shopping center in North America.
Well, that's all, generally speaking, quite busy now still. People are still going about their business. But I did recently read a report by Deloitte, weirdly, that suggested that the footfall traffic was down something like 22% 2018 to 2019, and a further 42% between 2019 and just before the start of the pandemic. That wouldn't necessarily match my own understanding of walking around Mals and seeing pretty busy environments.
Here in the US, the shutdown was extreme. And really, people were hesitant to re-enter malls for most of 2020. If it were a large enclosed mall, outdoor malls fared much better. Strip centers, power centers fared much better than a fully enclosed suburban mall did. What we've seen since the vaccine release is that even the enclosed malls been readopted by consumers, and they're back in full force.
Just before the pandemic, I noticed a lot of commentary about mixed use, and it's really going back to some of the stuff that you brought forward, Jeff, in the sense of financing organisation would support MAUs with effectively a single-use purpose. When I think about MAUs, that's mostly what I see is retail, or there's something else. They're not MAUs. They're very little in the way of real mixed use, where you have people live in there, maybe school in there, some stores, some entertainment, some food courts, healthcare centres and stuff like that, all amalgamated into a community. And I'm not quite sure if when people talked about mixed use, 2-3 years ago, if they're actually seeing this very involved, immersive kind of community-led approach, or if they were just saying, well, if there's less stores in there, or it's to convert that to living accommodation, or bring in some restaurants, or do something. It was a more of a desperation thing to fill the gap, to maintain the revenue model, as opposed to where are consumers going. Of course, in 2019 and the start of 2020, nobody knew what was ahead of us. So it'd be interesting to see how vibrant those conversations are now that we're very uncertain about what a future might look like. But we certainly had 18 months of complete confusion and a retraction of consumers from shopping at MAUs because of lockdowns, obviously, and their conversion to online versus MAUs. But I think that people are still going out to MAUs. I went round to my local centre about a month ago. We were in lockdown in Ontario up until the early part of, I think it was June, wasn't it, Craig? And then they opened up, and I went in a couple of Sundays after that, and I didn't actually see very much shopping. I saw lots of people milling around it was an enclosed mall. Saw lots of people in their walkways, but actually very few people actually in stores, except for one or two notable stores which had queues like Lululemon, H&M, and whatever. But the majority of the stores in this relatively busy mall were not being shopped.
We'll track that with a lot of the retail sales figures that we get when you break it down to subsector, and you can see what are the expenditures in this specific category of store. And some of them are very mall specific. We've seen it pick up. I mean, we're seeing the sales pick up, and a lot of the mall landlords are saying that their mall sales per square foot on the small shops are at or have exceeded 2019 levels. So the shopping is being done here. But with the mixed use portion of your comment, what are we seeing around discussion of that, further diversification of that real estate into a mixed use product from a pure play product? It's a tough slog because of these guys really legally tied themselves up to not have anything but a retail shopping center. And that is, there are so many restrictions on space use and how they can use their real estate that they're almost pigeonholed into retail, and not just retail in general. A lot of them had agreements in there that they wouldn't have a grocery store. That there were a number of carve-outs that for one reason or another, they decided to exclude certain uses in there. I'm sure everyone is probably, well, at least the mall landlord is regretting those agreements at this point, but it serves as a nice comfort for them for a period of time and very distinctly define them. But, getting back to y'all's comments around there is no town center in these suburbs, conversion of that retail shopping center into that center of commerce and activity would be ideal. I just don't know, what it would take to fully get that done unless the mall was completely vacated and new zoning was applied to it.
Yeah, and the department stores in some cases really were able to control the future development. I was also told that, and these are Canadian landlords again, when Sears was shutting down in Canada, because we no longer have it here, some of the landlords, they were not that unhappy with the situation because they were given a level of flexibility to do things with their shopping center that they didn't have before, because Sears in a lot of cases ended up taking over retail spaces from retailers that were along the lines of, say, Eaton's or Simpson's or Woodward's, which had 99-year leases on their shopping centers, could basically dictate what could be done. And this basically prevented these landlords from being able to do certain things that they wanted to do, including mixed use for their shopping centers. I was working on the shopping center study for a few years. We're going to be hopefully releasing something coming up here at some point in the next few months. It's going to be a challenge because of the shutdowns. Landlords may not want to necessarily cooperate, but what I noticed before the pandemic was landlords certainly had an appetite to try to capitalize on their properties through density, which means that not just having retail there, putting housing, whether or not that's condominium units to sell off or whether or not that's rental apartment buildings that would create a continuous stream of income, or office buildings or other uses, or even just attractions to bring people in, whether or not it's a park, or I don't know if you can call that an attraction or a school, but certainly a mixed use traffic generator. And one thing I'm wondering too, we're seeing this a bit more in the United States, is fulfillment and micro fulfillment within shopping centers. And Gary, this is something probably that you could answer, just given your expertise around this, is what might we see with shopping centers in terms of storage and fulfillment, even for e-commerce or click and collect?
I suspect that as anchors vacate, it will create this space, and it's whether or not that space can actually be used for fulfillment purposes, supporting inbound goods into the mall for all the retailers, being booked in, being stored. And one of three things happening. One is to top up the shelves day to day. The other one is click and collect across multiple brands, multiple banners, and obviously home delivery is an extension of that. So that for me is a great opportunity of malls. Mixed use, single use, it doesn't matter. I come from retail, so it'd be better if it was just single use, but I'm kind of getting more flexible in my views. But that fundamental concept of having an app that people can sit on their settees and be able to shop across brands, and to give a direction whether or not I'll come and pick that up by drive past, and you can put it in my boot, or you can bring it to my porch, or cross my threshold, or I'll come and pick it up by actually going to the store. They're the two missing pieces of a jigsaw for me. One is converting that former, say, anchor like Sears, because certainly my local mall, that Sears closed in 2017, is still empty, 2021. That must be a big cost for that now. So using that space, and the other one is finding an app which can go across all of the brands, not just the ones with existing capabilities in putting their stuff out on the web, but actually all brands. And if you come into my mall as a mall owner, I want you to sign up to this set of systems. You can interface them with your existing POS systems and digital applications, but you must do this so we can then present to our community, as opposed to, well, you've got a Canadian Tire app, you use that for that, and etc. You need to combine all these things into an omni-mall as opposed to individual brands. And the other one around that, sort of an adjacency, if we think about a single use for now, and is being able to create some interest in that mall for people to drive traffic into the mall. So the flexibility of rental agreements, both for retail and for the landlord, must be now moved forward, so that if a retail concept is failing in the mall, actually it's in the interest of the landlord to get shot of it. So rather than saying, no, we're signing you up for 10 years, bank that money for the next 10 years and turn our back while, that area of the mall is looking quite, dilapidated. Nobody's going down there very much because they don't like that particular banner. That needs to come out. And similarly, to be able to bring in things on a pop-up basis, that you just create the environment, create the application that allows them to sell through your website, the mall website, but to actually move these things through the mall. So there's always a reason for people to come to the mall as well as order from the mall.
I think both of y'all touched on this, the closure of department stores, weak department stores, and viable shopping centers is the term I like to use is addition by subtraction. You can do a lot more with something else there than a Sears that's on its last leg, right? You made a great point, Gary. The retailers, we've been harping on them for years to embrace omnichannel. You guys have to get involved and be where your customers are. But it's time for the landlords to really think about how do they get involved in omnichannel and taking some of these old spaces, vacated spaces, as you were saying, and converting them to an omnichannel platform for small shop retailers, where they could potentially get that last mile delivery to their end consumer. That is truly a win-win-win situation for the landlord of the mall, for the retailers leasing the space, and for the consumers that are getting their products in the mode that they'd like to get them.
I'm wondering where we go from here in terms of shopping centers, in terms of the tenant mix. And Jeff, I'll come back to you on that. What do you see in terms of, say, temporary leases, percentage rent leases? And then we can talk about, the future of the properties overall. As we look into a bit of the future here, I mean, one thing that I've noticed, I'll just kind of kick it off, is graduated leases. And what I mean by that is, say for this year, there'll be a reduced rate. Next year, there'll be a reduced rate, but it'll be a little bit higher than this year. And then in 2023, there could be full market rent like a retailer may have paid in 2019.
Yeah, there's a lot of legality to still work out between the landlords and the tenants that skip their rent. We'll see what that ends up being, what 2019, 2020 rent actually was, and then who's left to pay 2021, 2022, and further on down the line. Graduated rent is merely a bet on inflation, if you ask me. I mean, we were always trying to get as much as we could, and an easier way to do that is not, have a huge jump, just have a bunch of small jumps along the way. So graduated rent, I think will probably stick around, although it could be to the detriment of the landlord, certainly if inflation really picks up. But as far as the percentage rent side of that, Craig, the cost of goods sold for most retailers has declined so much over the last 10 years or so, based on their supply chains and where they're getting their products from, that had been moved to low manufacturing cost areas like China. Their cost of goods sold is flatter down, and so if they have flat sales, their profitability could be higher than before. And so the landlord charges rent, well, at least here, they like to call it occupancy cost. That is your base rent plus your common area maintenance, real estate taxes, and insurance divided by the gross sales of that store. So Macerich likes to say that we like to get 16% occupancy cost. So that's really how much does it cost that tenant to be in that shopping center versus the volume of sales that they have. And that metric's been breaking down because the retailers have been in a good mall, they have been as profitable as ever, but their sales haven't changed a whole lot. And that's just because of they're able to get cheaper product and they can discount it. And it shows up in their sales as flat or maybe up a little. It all depends on the volume, but generally we haven't seen the inflation pushing. The rent needs to follow inflation, right? One way or the other. So The percentage rent is more or less dissipated as even being a possibility. I mean, it was that last line of defense. If inflation really picked up and there was an escalation in the lease, but the sales of that retailer would have grown with that inflation, and that's kind of that emergency ramp where the landlord would actually get some more money if inflation blew out. So that's the way I've always looked at it and recently understood it from the last 10 years.
Gary, you might have some insight into this. I've been told by some retailers that, well, this is around supply chain again. That's why I'm asking the question. That some costs have certainly gone up. We've got container ships that are maybe not stranded off port, but are not able to dock to deliver some goods, depending, for various reasons. We've actually got Canadian Tire that purchased part of a port to be able to continue with its operations in terms of getting products to consumers. And certainly the cost, I think, from the shipping standpoint, at least here in Canada, there's complexities where a country that's large, this has been a little bit of a challenge. Gary, do you have any insights into that?
Yeah, it's all getting very, very much more expensive very quickly. The point that Jeff made before, in the sense of as he looks in the US market, there's stock unavailability, and also the shelf price of things that are starting to rise to suppress people's interest in buying things. But I think the big issue around the supply chain is that to try and break out of this, we haven't got many options. We've typically been buying from the Far East for years. It's all been going the right way. The prices have been coming down. We get container loads. We don't have too much disruption to service. The only disruption is when you open up and loads of insects fall out. You send it back. You've always had containers. You've always had pallets. If you put things on pallets in containers, you've always had ships to move things around. Everything's been very easy. Obviously we do some firefighting along the way, but generally speaking, very easy. All of a sudden, we've had restrictions on the actual manufacturing aspect, because they've been in lockdown, and often that lockdown has been out of step with our demand patterns. Then when they get back to manufacturing, they've got probably your competitors all coming into the same factory and they're squabbling for production slots. Then once they produce it, they have to get it to a port, and that's assuming the port is open and functioning. It's got ships coming in and berthing and containers. We seem to, in the early stage, in March, April, May time, sort of sent ships out across the world and just left the empty containers and come back empty with ships, because there was such a demand starting to build. Getting the ship, making sure you get on it and not rolled over, which could be another week, 2 weeks delay, assuming the port's working or the terminal in the port is working that you've been assigned to, getting it across here, as you rightly say, Craig, in the Los Angeles port area, there was a holding bay of 24 big ships waiting to get into and being allowed to come onto the dock to be unloaded, and then to find a truck to take it to a railhead to move it across into relevant territory, and then find another truck and a skeletal frame to move it to a DC. So all these things are under the microscope. As Sunlight's really been shone a very strong light on this just-in-time supply chain management thing, which has really been proven to not being just-in-time at all, and not being at all resilient. So the option is, let's go local. Well, that's fine. If you can find the artisans, the tradespeople, the factory capacity, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 providers who aren't actually themselves buying stuff from the Far East. So the options of getting out of this in the short term are incredibly limited. You have to shout very loud at your suppliers and your logistic partners to try and elevate your product towards your stores quicker than your competitors. And that's the unfortunate consequence. But, when prices for raw materials like lumber are going up 4 times, 4 times the price it was pre-pandemic, and then the freight is moving at, instead of $2,000 a container, $65,000 for a container. It's very hard for retailers to try and work out, am I going to get the stock and what should I price it at when I get it? So I've got enough money to place another order.
And I think that's an underappreciated risk, Gary. Just getting the products to the retailers to sell to the consumers is very difficult. And if there's much more turmoil in the coming months, Christmas will be a very, very strange season this year.
Yeah, no, it's been a challenge. And I guess the last question we've got here is jumping back into the shopping center conversation. Where do things go from here? Again, I've done the shopping center studies. We were tracking developers that were looking at doing mixed use with their centers before the pandemic, as well as looking at, trying to do buzzy pop-ups. There's all kinds of stuff to activate the shopping centers, try to make them more interesting. Do you guys have any predictions on what we might see in the future in terms of shopping centers in North America, whether or not they be demolished, whether or not they be redeveloped? And of course, that's going to be location dependent too.
I think 20 to 30% are going to be repurposed, demolished and repurposed. They probably should never have been built, or they were built and killed by a competitor before or after. So I think we'll see in the United States, I'm fond of saying we're not over retailed, we're under demolished. We'll get that taken care of and sorted out eventually. But beyond that, we have a lot of great, well-located shopping centers that are just on terrific real estate, backed by fantastic communities. And I think we'll see more and more redevelopment to a mixed-use component. It makes sense in a number of instances. But as Gary was saying earlier, I think there is an opportunity to really support the tenants and the income stream they have in place by providing a last mile option for those retailers that both inhabit that space or want to have that last mile option by having a presence in that warehouse that they could convert that department store into. And so, yeah, I think right now they're throwing wet noodles against the wall and seeing what sticks. I know CBL has done a casino with an old anchor in Pennsylvania. You're seeing just about everything in terms of what happens with these old spaces if they're not retail. I think there's going to have to be some kind of gravitational force that keeps them retail centric, just based on the way that the centers are already set up. And what they do needs to be complementary to their current tenant base, and more than just revenue driven or what can get us purely the most dollars for that real estate without thinking about the remainder of the larger parcel.
I've got a number of thoughts, but the big thought that in light of what Jeff was suggesting, me and Jeff have talked about this more recently, is that certainly in the run-up to the pandemic, Amazon were taking over old decrepit malls, just taking them over. And their purpose in life is to get as much stock as close to a community as possible. And for reasonably well-located malls, which have fallen into disrepair, they're a hub. You can ram in 100 million SKUs into one of these reasonably big malls and serve all your customers. So the competitors to the mall is Amazon. Amazon are already organized. They've got property, they've got stock, and they've got logistics, all organized under one management team. At the moment, malls have got malls, they've got stores, and they've got stock, and they're not very well coordinated. So they have to find a way of bringing that together very quickly and working collaboratively to make their mall both a destination for the mobile phone, but also a destination which perhaps in the short term Amazon can't do, make their mall a destination in a retail sense. So that is, for my mind, if they can't get to that same kind of way of thinking that we've got the stock, we've got the retail brands, and we can get into the community, we can get this stock out, and we can also bring consumers to our environment and try and upsell them on that. That's the advantage, but they have to get much more coordinated than they currently are. And I know that we've got, I think, Ivanhoe and Oxford all doing their small bits. I don't know if it's part of a bigger plan, but it all looks like a somewhat piecemeal tactics right now than overall sort of embracing strategy that gets them to knock Amazon out of their local community.
Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for this. It's very interesting to discuss shopping centers here. I think the future is going to be quite interesting. One of my thoughts is shopping center landlords are actually going to have a fairly significant impact on the future of our cities in terms of, as we, at least in Canada, see these town centers developing with the shopping centers. The landlords themselves are actually going to have a fairly key role, I think, in developing these new town centers, which we will be seeing here in Canadian cities. We're going to see it in the United States, but I think in Canada we're a little bit ahead just because of our real estate prices and the fact that we actually don't have a lot of this space and how our cities are developing, especially in Toronto, which is just seeing explosive growth, and what's going to see it again, I think. So I want to say thank you so much, both of you. We've got Gary Newbury. He's a senior executive on call and supply chain specialist with a specialty in last mile, as well as Jeff Davenport. He's a real estate analytics expert and strategist. I want to say thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Craig.
And I'm Craig Patterson, editor-in-chief of Retail Insider. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Take care and bye for now.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.